Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. My name is Jay, and I'll be running the tech side of things. In that vein, we have a couple of housekeeping points. ASL interpretation and captioning are available. I want to thank our ASL interpreters, Juniper and Antonio, and our live captioner, Danielle, for helping make this event accessible. To enable captions, click the CC button on the bottom of your screen. And to pose a question to the panelists, click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can use the chat feature to ask questions as well. Now, just for some quick bios of our participants here. Angela Y. Davis is a political activist, academic, and author of 10 books and numerous articles. Davis is Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz in its History of Consciousness department. In 1997, Davis co-founded Critical Resistance, an organization working towards the abolition of what she and others have called the prison industrial complex. Liat Ben-Moshe is a scholar activist working in the intersection of disability/madness, decarceration, deinstitutionalization, and abolition. She is an associate professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And in addition to editing the book Decarcerating Disability, she's co-editor of the anthology Disability Incarcerated. Beth E. Richie is head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the author of Compelled to Crime and Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation. And she's a founding member of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. Maya Schenwar is editor-in-chief of Truthout. She's the co-author with Victoria Law of Prison by Any Other Name and the author of Locked Down, Locked Out. She is the co-editor of Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect? Police Violence and Resistance in the United States. And finally, Victoria Law is a freelance journalist focused on issues of incarceration. She's Maya's co-author of Prison by Any Other Name. Her other books are Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, and Prisons Keep Us Safer, and 20 other myths about mass incarceration. And a quick note about the New Press. We were founded in 1992 as a nonprofit book publisher with a public interest mission. The New Press publishes books that explore issues that affect us all. Its authors provide ideas and inspiration for the activists, teachers, policymakers, and everyday citizens who are working to defend and promote democracy. We do our work with the help of many of our supporters. Please visit us at thenewpress.com or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to find out more. And with that, I'll pass the mic to Victoria.
Thanks, Jay, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being with us on this lovely Friday afternoon, whatever time zone you are in. We are thrilled to be in conversation with everybody. I'm from New York City, which is traditional Lenape territory from which they were pushed out in the late 18th century. I am wearing, what am I wearing? A black lace top, and I am against a red wall with an amazing piece of art, which most people can't see because it's too high up, that says "No Justice, No Peace," drawn by a woman incarcerated in Pennsylvania. There is a partial bookshelf, and I am wearing cat skeleton mermaid earrings. I am thrilled to be on this panel with some of the people whose work and writings and thinkings have really influenced my work over the years as a baby abolitionist and now as a not so baby abolitionist. Maya and I are the co-authors of Prison by Any Other Name. We're thrilled to be in conversation with Liat Ben-Moshe, who is the author of Decarcerating Disability, which also informed our book greatly. And we are super thrilled to be in conversation with Angela Davis and Beth Richie, who along with Gina Dent and Erica Miners are the co-authors of the upcoming Abolition, Feminism Now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm Maya, and I'm also so excited to be here with folks who have influenced me so much over the years. For those who can't see me, I'll self-describe. I'm a white, femme-looking woman with long brown hair. I have green eyes, and I'm wearing a bluish green short sleeve shirt. And in my background, there's just a closed window with a window shade. And there used to be a bookcase there, but it actually collapsed over the past year, which is kind of symbolic. I, as well as Beth and Liat, are currently in Chicago, which is on the unceded land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as others such as the Miami and Ho-Chunk nations. Liat and I started talking about organizing this event about a year ago, around the time that Decarcerating Disability was released, and just before Prison by Any Other Name was released. And one of the things that we realized immediately that bound our books together was their covers. So there are concentric circles on the covers of both books. And on Liat's, there are green circles. On ours, they're barbed wire. And when we chose the concentric circles, when Vicki and I were discussing it, we were thinking about how they show the way that the prison industrial complex or the carceral state extends out and out, just entrapping more and more aspects of society in its clutches. But what I love about Liat's book cover is that the concentric circles actually at some point fade and disintegrate. And so yes, the carceral state is vast, but it's not unbreakable. So regardless of what you think of our book covers, I think those themes are definitely something that all of us in this group today are grappling with, recognizing the deep and vast extent of state violence and how it extends into all kinds of places that we might not even realize, including places we might think of as benevolent, but then also the knowledge that there are pathways to move beyond this violence, including those that are already actively happening and also those that we can't see yet. So abolitionist presents and futures. And when we heard about Abolition Feminism Now, which, as Vicki mentioned, is the forthcoming book by Angela and Beth, as well as Gina Dent and Erica Miners, we got really excited just thinking about how that book is going to help shine a light on those presents and futures in terms of ways to confront both state and interpersonal violence. So we really wanted to get together and talk about it all. And today, right, we're going to discuss incarceration, or more broadly, carcerality in many different forms. But all of this is pointing us toward the goal of uprooting carcerality and planting new ways of collectively being and building. So we're going to talk about all that too. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. Massive appreciation. And I'll hand it over to Vicki for the first question.
Thanks. So Angela and Beth, the first question is for you both. You've both read our books. You've both given us amazing blurbs. Your work, both of your works, have informed me and Maya's work throughout the years and has informed our book and influenced our book. What has our book or our books, me and Maya's and Liat's, brought to light for you that you had not realized before? You can thumb wrestle if you want to figure out who goes first.
Angela, shall I start, or did you want to go first? Me?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay, all right, good. I'll go first by saying a huge thank you to the New Press for this event, and to Angela for sharing writing space with me over the last year on our book project, Abolition Feminism Now. To Maya, Victoria, and Liat Prison by Any Other Name and Decarcerating Disability are such important books. Really excited to talk about them in conversation with each other today. And I also want to just say to the audience who we can't see how much I appreciate you. It feels like knowing that there's so many people here or there or somewhere today as part of this event makes me feel very hopeful. I feel like there's this kind of wave of abolition, building momentum. And in the end, I feel like we're going to land in a different place. I feel like there's this sort of washing over that I feel. And I'm really encouraged and appreciate those of you who are here. Like the books, you give me a lot of hope. So I'm Beth Richie. I'm sitting at a desk in my office. The office has turquoise walls. And behind me are three kind of abstract pictures of Black figures. I'm sitting in a chair at a desk. I have brown hair and brown short hair, brown skin. I'm wearing a black shirt, and I will have my glasses on and off throughout our time, I imagine. So yes, huge thanks for the books and thanks for the work. It's been important to us writing Abolition Feminism Now to think about sort of the books that are occupying the same spaces that we are. Abolition Feminism Now is influenced by these books, but so are many other things that I am doing, like teaching at Stateville Prison, like building with comrades from the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project in Chicago, building a group called Abolition Teaching and Learning Network. They've informed me as I've thought about how to, with a group of really exciting colleagues at the University of Illinois, Chicago, how to transform a criminology program to include a dedicated abolition-oriented academic space. And maybe most importantly, influenced my ongoing work in the sphere of ending gender violence in such a way that we're attending to state violence and the spread of carcerality as it really limits people who experience gender violence opportunities for safety and freedom. Because for me, that includes ending police and prisons as part of our work to provide safety for those who are most harmed. And in particular, I lift up the way that both of these books talk about how important it is to, even when we're trying to respond to individual harm, to resist the moves to reform and instead abolish. So taken together, these books bring out two key reminders that I want to emphasize as we get started. The first key reminder is that carcerality, which is the instinct to criminalize and the drive to punish, and the willingness, the political willingness to permanently disenfranchise people, whether we call it social death or carceral citizenship or the buildup of a prison nation, is held up by forces of racial capitalism, neoliberalism, heteropatriarchy. All of these things support carcerality, and those things are really, really strong. Equally important to how strong those forces are, they're also insidious. They're everywhere. They're sometimes disguised as other things. And they pose a huge threat, not only because they're so strong and so powerful, but also because sometimes they're hard to see and hard to hold. And for me, the work that these two books do, and I'm sure many people on this webinar are doing, these books make visible the harm of reform that's in the space, not just the space of prisons and policing, but in so many spaces that we find ourselves, spaces that require a serious abolition politic. And indeed, Vicki, as the subtitle of your book suggests, harmful reforms have serious consequences. And in your book in particular, in so many chapters, from policing parenthood chapter to the one that's titled something like Your Home is Your Prison, you make the case through vivid stories that harmful reforms have serious consequences, and we have to attend to those as part of our abolition praxis. Indeed, the overall point of decarcerating disability is that nothing short of abolition will lead to liberation. No deinstitutionalization, no expanding access, all those things that we typically think about won't bring disability justice. Only abolition will. And both of you make this case clearly, because if nothing else, I think activists and readers who close the covers of your books with those beautiful spirals, readers will understand how harmful, and I guess not just inadequate, but how harmful reform can be at the level of lived experience, because you so center your work in the lived experience, how harmful it will be for people trying to survive, and how harmful it will be for us trying to build a mass movement to create the world we want, unless we attend to all of the places on that spiral where carcerality happens. I just want to say one other thing that I think your books offer to our thinking about abolition feminism now, and that is that we urgently need a feminist abolition praxis. And that praxis has to evolve alongside what we're trying to describe in the book as Black feminism and other feminisms advanced in communities of color. Because the specific feminist analysis that has to inform abolition is historical. It's historical analyses of people who've been mobilizing against state violence for years. It has to be international. Right, Angela? It has to be international. It has to focus on the lived experience of resistance that's both abolition and feminist at the same time, so that gender kind of gets centered in the work, where we were looking at people who are trying to kind of take care of their business and take care of other people and slowly changing the world for the people that they love. And often that's against gender oppression. I guess what I'm saying here is that so much of what I read in these books is about gender and sexuality and how state violence works to control bodies and make bodies subhuman. And these are feminist questions that are best answered by a feminist abolition analysis. And in many ways, I think that's what your books are calling for. Abolition has to be feminist, and indeed feminism has to be abolitionists. Angela?
Well, thank you so much, Beth. Pardon me, a bunch of windows popped up on my screen and I had to close them. First of all, I want to thank you, Maya and Vicky and Liat for inviting me and Beth to participate in this conversation with you. And I should say that I live on Ohlone land in what is often currently described as Oakland. I am 77 years old. I am a Black woman, light skinned. I'm wearing a black jacket. And I see that for some reason my screen is frozen. And I apologize if the image, for those of you who can see, doesn't come through. But I think probably lots of people are using the internet in my community, which is not that good. So I'm wearing a black jacket, a floral scarf, glasses, and earrings. I'm in my study where I should say I spend most of my time. And behind me, as well as on either side, which is not really visible from the camera angle, are bookcases, floor-to-ceiling bookcases, lots of books. But also, there's a small painting of the Brazilian activist who was assassinated by former police in Rio a few years ago, Marielle Franco. the first question you posed is a little difficult for me to answer because I feel like I learned so much. And for example, prison by any other name, I was really especially struck by the critique of community policing and the way it serves, as you point out, to create open air prisons. And this is a concept I first encountered during a visit to Palestine, where people described the constant military and police surveillance, the checkpoints and other carceral strategies that don't necessarily involve actual material incarceration, but where they describe that form of existence as inside an open air prison. And of course, Palestinians, often point out that Palestine is the largest open air prison in the world. So your book made me take more seriously the lessons that we have learned from people who are struggling against the occupation in Palestine. I should also say, I really appreciate the rigorous way in which Maya and Vicky analyzed the carceral underpinnings in institutions that we take for granted, residential treatment sentences. And I think that we will be addressing the foster care system more thoroughly in the period to come. I'm thinking about Dorothy Roberts' a focus on the foster care system, the family policing system. And so in general, I find myself really struck by the way in which your book emphasizes the importance of always moving beyond the actual footprint of the prisons. And of course, Prisons by Any Other Name is the title. And the way you urge us to consider the carceral logic that continues to underpin so many reforms and alternatives. Now with Liat's book, and let me say that just as I have been following both of you, Maya and Vicky, for a long time, I've been following Liat's work since she was a graduate student. I had the very good fortune of having her in a seminar, a graduate seminar I taught at Syracuse University many years ago. But let me say that I so appreciated reading Decarcerating Disability. And I was especially struck by the critique of the logic that links psychiatric deinstitutionalization to the problems that led to homelessness and increased incarceration. And let me say that I, like many others, had not recognized the extent to which I had absorbed the ideologies of neoliberalism, because many times I talked about the fact that the three largest mental institutions in the country are jails. And I know as a consequence of reading this book that in talking about jails as present-day mental institutions, I was helping to bolster that logic that allows us to gloss over the impact of increased racism and neoliberal strategies related to privatization. So thank you so much, Liat. I've been very careful about the way I formulate that relationship as a consequence of reading your book. And also the notion of abolition as disepistemology. And of course, I had read your article before the book came out, but I appreciate the way in which the book emphasizes how much we have to unlearn certain ideological representations of disability, how we have to figure out how to let go of these normative ways of apprehending disability. And I love the way in which you describe disability madness as a way of being in the world, and your critique of the usual ideological representation of disability as loss, or as failure, or as negative in that way. And I see that a half an hour has already unfolded, and of course I could spend the rest of the time allotted for the entire program talking about the insights that both of your books have produced for me. But let me thank you for doing this work. And also I want to say that your interventions, the three of you, have helped to create a context in which we are now able to engage in serious mainstream conversations about abolition. So, thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your intellectual interventions. And I look forward to the remainder of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Angela and Beth, for everything you just said about our books. That was really meaningful to hear. I'm just overwhelmed and grateful that you found them useful. So this question is for Liat and Vicky to begin with. Anyone can jump in, but both of our books talk about the connections between punitiveness and therapy or treatment. And I think some people might at first glance see treatment as the opposite of prison, but actually punitiveness and treatment become really entangled with each other within carceral logic. So Liat and Vicky, can you give us some examples of how this is happening?
Thank you, Maya, for that question that I'm going to ask I'm going to act like we didn't write together. But it's a really good question. But I really want to first, let me first describe myself for those who can't see. So I'm, I don't know, is 40s like middle age? I don't know, I'm in my 40s. I'm femme. I'm wearing lipstick and makeup, and I have earrings, and my earrings say gladiolas, not cages. And I'm wearing glasses. I have short hair. I'm white, very pale today. Anyway, haven't gotten tanned yet. It's still, summer is only beginning here in Chicago. Behind me is a background of the book cover that Maya described at the beginning, which is concentric circles in green, and at the edge of them, they're kind of exploding. And it's a Zoom background. And I want to really thank Beth and Angela for that amazing kind of recap of our books and what they brought to you. And I want to kind of start from there, from where you both ended, which is this idea of corrections and treatment being somehow different from each other. That you both, as you stated, both Maya's book and my book and a lot of people's work works really hard to debunk that. So I guess that's where I kind of want to begin, is with this idea that rehabilitation or corrections, whether we use the word corrections rhetorically or in praxis, it's about fixing individual people through really oppressive normative frameworks. And I want to emphasize that, as I say in the book, and as a lot of Indigenous scholars show, it's really something that started in the colonial encounter. But for both disability cultures and for abolitionists, I think we share this kind of critique of rehabilitation, of disciplining and controlling bodies, like Beth was saying, and minds as well, of trying to normalize people through this act of civilization, right? You have to be more civilized, which of course is colonial, especially in North America. The practice started by trying to civilize indigenous communities and assimilating them through training schools, quote unquote, boarding schools, and of course now through prisons. So what I'm saying is that both of these frameworks or epistemologies of disability culture, med culture, and abolition are really against this concept of corrections, whether it's through the correctional industry, what we call the criminal injustice system, or through physical or behavioral modification that are pushed for those who are considered to be in deficit, exactly what Angela was just talking about. And so it might be obvious to people why treatment behind bars might be problematic, but I want to stress that most treatments in the US and in the Western context are problematic outside of the carceral or criminal justice system. Especially when we think about it through an intersectional, or as Angela was talking about, through a transnational and decolonial perspective. So the emphasis on fixing people and conforming them and not talking about social issues is the problem. So what does it mean, for example, to talk about madness or post-traumatic stress or trauma in the context of Palestine, for example, like Angela was just talking about? What does it mean to talk about it in relation to wars and infinite wars and relentless wars? What does it mean in like an indigenous context? And so we're starting to kind of, I think, through that framework, really have a perspective that the line between punitiveness and treatment, or the line that we can call both of them corrections, is very, very blurred. And is actually the root of it is the same thing. And the root of it is eugenics, it's colonialism, it's racism, and so on. And I just want to end, and I think this will tie into what Vicky is going to talk about. And this is something, again, that connects very much my work and Maya and Vicky's work, is that often this kind of exceptionalism, right? People with mental health differences should not be in jail and prisons. People with mental health differences need to be in places of treatment. And what we need to do is, this is what the state says, is to open up spaces of treatment that may or may not be actual jails and prisons. There might be actual jails or prisons, or they might be psychiatric, or they might be halfway homes, and so on and so on. And this is what I called in the book carceral ableism, or carceral saneism. Saneism meaning the oppression of people that are mad, that are non-conforming, that are quote unquote irrational, and so on. So it's the imperative to be sane at all times. So carceral saneism is exactly this belief, very much connected to carceral feminism and embedded in carceral feminism. It's the belief that people, women, people with disabilities, women with disabilities, need special or extra protection in ways that often expand and legitimate their further marginalization and their further incarceration. So this idea of carceral sanism is what leads to the buildup of what Beth Richie calls the prisonation, or the buildup of things like mental health jails and units. But like I said earlier, it really is important to me to say that treatment, even outside of cages, which we might think is completely, can never happen, a treatment can never happen in a cage. But I want to ask us to think through, what does biopsychiatry and what does treatment, medical treatment and corrections mean also outside of cages?
Thank you, Liat. Another way that we're seeing treatment intersect with this carceral logic is the increasing recognition that we should not be criminalizing substances and substances that are currently illegal, but instead of just decriminalizing, pushing people into mandated drug treatment and drug rehab. And that's seen as a kinder and gentler approach than locking them up inside prisons. But it is still a way in which people's liberty is being taken. It still takes away people's freedom. It's a door that only opens from one way, typically. And inside these drug treatments and rehab centers, people face a complete loss of autonomy, including practices that are very much the same as in prisons, like when to get up, when to eat, when they can go to programs, what they can do in those programs, when they can go to sleep. They are unable typically to communicate with their family members or other loved ones for a certain period of time. And even when they are allowed, it is very strictly monitored. One of our early book events for that Maya and I did was with somebody who was in a drug rehab center, an inpatient drug rehab center, and she had voluntarily checked herself in. And even though she had voluntarily checked herself in, her cell phone was still taken away. She had to ask permission to be part of the event. I spent numerous calls trying to explain to this counselor what the event was and trying to allow her to get permission to be part of this event. They didn't want her to be on Zoom. They didn't want her to be unsupervised in an office with a computer. Again, she did not sign up to have her liberty stripped away. She signed up to go to a 30-day treatment program, and she was treated as if, she had basically signed up to have all of her bodily autonomy taken away from her. And these are all the ways in which carceral logics creep into things that are supposed to be helpful. And I put that in quotes because I am not sure how helpful it is to have everything taken away from you and have all of your abilities to make your own decisions taken as if you are a 3-year-old. And we are seeing more and more this push to mandate people to go to drug treatment or drug rehab. And when they do not, or when they fail to meet the guidelines or the rules or the restrictions of these drug treatment centers or these drug rehabs, they are threatened with imprisonment. So it is not necessarily a choice to go to these systems. Again, we also see that people who are shuttled through these systems are often the same people who would be shuttled through jails and prisons. And oftentimes they end up going through a cycle of places that are either prison light, like rehabs, or prisons themselves. But again, we're seeing this posited as kinder, gentler approaches to substance use rather than looking at root causes, such as the drug war is ridiculous and should be abolished, and that drug use should not be criminalized simply because somebody is using substances that are currently criminalized. So what we see again is ways in which the prison nation, to use a term that Beth Richie has coined, reproduces itself in so many different ways, including positioning itself as something more helpful, such as treatment for somebody rather than simply punishment. Now I'm going to actually ask the next question, which is for Maya and Beth. How does the field of social work, even beyond cages, but explicitly in carceral spaces, and other care professions, such as teaching and nursing, contribute to the systems of punishment, surveillance, and control? You can thumb wrestle if you want.
I don't know. Should I go, Maya? We didn't figure this
It's up
part
to you. Yeah, we didn't talk about order.
Yeah, I'll
choreograph it.
I know you'll finish with something strong, so I'll go. Thank you. Yeah, this question, Vicki, builds on what you just said. It's such a good question. And so I want to go back both to what you said and, to some of my earlier points about, carcerality being everywhere, and how it increasingly is disguised as care. And I'm going to say, I think that process of disguising it as care is an intentional process. And I think in some ways it's connected to me to a kind of racial capitalist instinct about low-paid labor and who provides care and who directs what kind of care they provide, et cetera. So I thought it was interesting that you use social work and teaching as an example. I am a social worker. I was a social worker before I was a teacher, but I am currently a teacher. And so I know a little bit about both of these professions from my own experience. And, to start, these are both professions, and, you might argue nursing in some ways is too, that are professions. And by professions, I mean they're assumed to require a certain amount of training and a certain amount of credentialing, and that they're necessary, that this is the way that people heal and this is the way that people learn. And like Liat said, it's healing has to look a certain way, and only certain things are sort of legitimate to be taught and learned. And all of that is regulated by a profession that, of course, is authorized by the state. And so the first important thing is that these care professionals of, in some ways, low-paid labor, populated by, in hierarchical settings, but often the people who are paid the least and doing the most care and most heavily regulated by the state are people who are otherwise disenfranchised. But the professional is assumed to know better than the people or the person needing care. Making it worse, these professionals, unlike some of the others that we talked about, are potentially more harmful because, in the sense of this disguise notion that I'm talking about, because these professions have a kind of explicit helping value base. You're taught in social work school that what you're supposed to do is provide opportunities for empowerment or support or expanding opportunities. That's part of why people become teachers. And sometimes it makes it hard because there's a sort of value base inherent in the professionalization of this care work. The professionalization and control of the care work. They're theoretically guided by values that many of us as abolitionists would agree with, right? And yet they're controlled by the state in service of carcerality. These are highly regulated professions. You have to be licensed. They're controlled through monitoring. There's a very rigid sense of accountability. They're funded through legislative processes. And so you're accountable to the state, not to the people who need care. And therefore, I think they're easily being co-opted as kind of service cops under the disguise of care. I think at this particular moment, we're seeing more and more as kind of overt policing, if you will, which is clearly transparent in service of the carceral state, replaced by these other forms of service cops, I'm calling them, who are controlled by the same carceral state. And it's being played out through a really elaborate network of carceral processes where helping professionals, willingly or unwillingly, are involved in the kind of things you talked about, Vicki: mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse, social workers being deployed as first responders, teachers with guns, accreditation policies that prohibit employment for people with a felony background, a mandatory 3-year post-victimization waiting period to be hired as a crisis counselor, sex offender registries, rescue programs for sex workers, zero tolerance programs. There's a whole list of ways that this category of care workers are highly regulated and controlled by the state and deployed in service of carcerality and occupy a very particular occupational position in capitalist hierarchy work. These carceral strategies, some in the name of reform, do not keep people safe. They don't necessarily give people what they want. They don't help people. They don't teach people, at least not what they want to learn or need to feel whole. They contribute to this distraction that I keep raising that I think is so important. And the distraction is, what's real safety? What's liberation from harm? And what does freedom look like? And so, you know, in the critique, we want to be sure that we're not trying to kind of service our way out of harmful situations or service our way out of oppressive systems. Yes, we need care. Yes, we need attention to our bodies and our spirits and our minds, but we also need freedom. And social workers and teachers and other helpers are, in my view, only as good as they are able to think about freedom and liberation as part of their work, not just carceral care.
Wow, thank you. I feel like we should have a whole supplement to our book that just says that. Oh, thank you, Beth. Yes, all of that. And I'll just add one arena that I want to draw particular attention to is the child welfare system. People in the professions that you mentioned, Vicki, are mandated reporters to so-called child protective services, which we might better refer to as the family regulation system, which is a term that has been lifted up by the movement for family power, Dorothy Roberts, and others. And so that means that social workers, teachers, nurses, doctors are required to report suspected child abuse and neglect. And we should remember that people's suspicions surrounding maltreatment are very subjective, and they're guided by racism, classism, ableism, patriarchal and heteropatriarchal structures. So social service workers are mandated reporters, and their reports can actually lead to very severe punishment, which is children being taken away and often put in foster care. So this is a pervasive form of surveillance. And most of the time, when parents and caregivers are reported to Child Protective Services, the allegation is neglect. And most allegations of neglect are related to poverty. So people not having adequate shelter or food or clothing, healthcare, these basic things are resulting in social workers often, or these other mandated reporters, filing these reports. And also we know from scholars and activists like Dorothy Roberts, Charity Tolliver, many others, the fact that Black and Indigenous families are targeted most when it comes to these kinds of poverty-driven allegations. And we also, thinking about all these issues that we've been talking about, we see that parents with disabilities and deaf parents tend to be targeted. There are lots of instances of caseworkers investigating deaf parents and not even providing communication access. So I want to touch on just one of the particular stories that Vicki and I shared in our book. It's about a mother who had her children taken away because she called a social service agency for help. She called a domestic violence center to seek help fleeing an abusive relationship. And shortly thereafter, DHS, so-called Child Protective Services, showed up at her door. And caseworkers took her 4 children away and told her that she wouldn't get her kids back until she got safe. Now, they gave her no resources to do that. And so she grabbed a backpack, left her home, but she didn't have housing. And she ended up sleeping on buses. And DHS then told her that her lack of income and secure housing was an additional reason that she could not be reunited with her kids. She was also chronically ill with a serious heart condition, and that condition worsened in the midst of this whole situation, as we often see with the criminal punishment system and all of its extensions. So not long after this woman fled her home, she had a heart attack and a stroke, which ended up seriously impacting her vision. And still, she was not given assistance. And in fact, DHS told her that her health was yet another reason that she couldn't get her kids back. So as we've been talking about, ableism is really enmeshed with the violence of these punishment systems, which are enmeshed also with capitalism. So this woman ended up living at a city homeless shelter, still only seeing her kids at supervised visits, of course, supervised by social workers. And the next step for her was a standardized test. So she was supposed to take a standardized test on parenting. And without that, she couldn't make progress toward getting her kids back. But she was worried about even being able to see the test because of these vision issues that were caused by her stroke. And DHS wouldn't make accommodations, wouldn't actually put in place any kind of access measures. And so she was being punished for her disability and punished, of course, for being a domestic violence survivor, which began this cycle. So at the point that our book was published, this survivor was still pushing against the system, struggling to get her children back despite her many efforts. So this is just one example of the ways that surveillance and punishment are built into that field of social work and many of these helping professions.
Maya, can I add one thing that I think, you know, I think that sometimes these discussions focus a lot on, well, let me say it this way. I think it's important to distinguish the people who do the work and the structure within which people are required to do their work. And I say that because I think there are some exciting alternatives. I know we'll get to those, but even at this point, you know, for people listening to think about how all of us in many ways are involved with our hands in carcerality, right? And it's both the need for a very personal inventory of what work we're doing, and even if we're calling ourselves abolitionists, what work we're doing that's building the carceral state, versus how to be really careful that everything we do, before we do it, everything we do is not reforming the carceral state to make it more comfortable. It's never comfortable. It can't be reformed. And I think sort of the individual responsibility in evaluating ourselves at the same time that we're trying to change the system is really important to keep first and foremost on our minds.
May I add something very brief to the conversation?
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, I was just thinking about an experience I had some years ago when I was teaching in the San Francisco County Jail, and brought in a couple of other teachers. And what I witnessed was the impact of the carceral structure on these two women who considered themselves radical in terms of their politics. But what I saw was the way in which the carceral regimes were seeping into their relationship with the women. It was, you know, as if there was an assumption that because they were in this carceral environment, they had to participate in the policing, and they did not even realize they were doing this. And I say this because I think we have to pay a great deal of attention to the structures, even when the actors have left. You know, what happens if we can get police out of all of the schools? The systems and the regimes are very much influenced, you know, by the presence of these school resource officers or the police. They can continue in the absence of the actual police being present. So it's not enough simply to say cops out of schools. We have to, you know, also examine the ways in which their presence has altered the very process of learning in these venues.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. Thank you both so much. I feel, yeah, we really delved into that question, and I appreciate both of your responses so much. I have a question for Liat, just pivoting a little bit. As we're thinking through these linkages between treatment and punishment, we run up against this myth so often, including in conversations on the left, that deinstitutionalization led to mass incarceration. And Liat, you were the person that taught me how this was fundamentally untrue. And you've done really important work debunking that whole false narrative. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Maya. And I think, you know, Angela, kind of, you started this thread at your beginning remark. And I want to thank you for listening to me talk about this for like, oh God, what, 10, 15 years now, something. So I think I'm going to try to do this really quickly, and you can read more about that in the book and other stuff that I've written. But there is this narrative that I think is very dangerous. And at the end, I'll tell you why. But there is this narrative that deinstitutionalization led to the rise in incarceration, and also the reason why there's so many quote unquote mentally ill people in prisons and jails is because they're not in psychiatric hospitals today. But my question is, why are we blaming deinstitutionalization on the prevalence of mental distress in jails and prisons even today, right? Even today in 2021, when this doesn't really hold water in terms of demographics or in terms of timing. So in terms of timing, for those who don't know, deinstitutionalization in psychiatric hospitals, the largest population happened in 1955 nationally, and ever since then, it's declined. So the biggest waves of deinstitutionalization happened in the 1960s. So by the time the 1980s hit, which is when we start to see huge mess of homelessness, housing insecurity, and so on in the United States, by the time the 80s hit, deinstitutionalization is in most states have already happened for decades and is no longer a thing. So it's very much, kind of curious that in terms of timing, it doesn't really work, but also in terms of demographic, just to recount this very quickly, generally speaking, people in mental hospitals, people who are confined in mental hospitals tended to be more white, older, and more equally distributed by gender than people who are incarcerated in prisons. And so we're not really talking about the same population that kind of like buses came and moved people from psych facilities into prisons. And this is why we see a rise of incarceration. And this is why we see more and more quote unquote mentally ill people in prisons. The reason why we see that is because, put it very bluntly, the prison is disabling and the prison is maddening. So and blaming deinstitutionalization for that really obscures that intrinsic nature of incarceration in prisons and jails. So for those who don't know, prisons and jails really create disabilities and psychiatric issues or exacerbate them for people who enter these facilities, these places of confinement with pre-existing conditions. And of course, they exacerbate it. I mean, think about gender non-conforming people, think about people who are queer or others that are placed in solitary confinement, for example. And think about yourself living in basically your toilet for, your bathroom with a toilet or an elevator with a toilet for 23 hours a day, and think about what that will do. And so I think it's really easy to find a scapegoat, and the scapegoat is deinstitutionalization. And so I just want to say that this is a very dangerous narrative for 3 reasons. And then I'll end. And by this narrative, I mean the narrative that deinstitutionalization led to the rise of incarceration, and also this idea, like Angela said at the beginning, that Cook County Jail, LA County Jail are the biggest mental health facilities. They're not mental health facilities, they're not treatment facilities because they just don't provide the treatment, right? But the 3 reasons why I think this is a dangerous narrative is 1, because it leads people then to call for 2 things. 1 is, oh my God, there's so many people who experience psychiatric distress in prisons and jails. Let's open, what we talked about earlier, what we talked about just now. Let's open units that are specifically psychiatric units in prisons and jail. Let's open new jails that are specifically for people with psychiatric distress. So of course, this increases the breach of the prisonation of carcerality. Secondly, it also paints deinstitutionalization as the culprit of the plight of people with mental health differences, both inside of prisons and outside of prisons, because it says, oh, now we don't have where to put them, right? Like we don't have psychiatric hospitals anymore. Well, of course, that's not a bad thing. This is something that people really, really fought really hard for. And so this is my 3rd point and last point. My book really tries to show that deinstitutionalization was a lot of things, including, a lot of things that went wrong, including a lot of things that people thought went right, but actually went white, for example, inclusion discourses and so on. But deinstitutionalization was also an abolitionary movement. It was something that a lot of people who were incarcerated and their families incarcerated in psych facilities, in residential institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. They really fought for this carceral regime to end. And guess what? They succeeded. And so for us to now blame things on that, and as Maya said, especially in the left, really shows a complete lack of understanding of disability and madness, knowledges, movements, and histories, which I'm not blaming anyone for. I myself didn't have a lot of this as a disabled person when I started, doing this work. But I want us to think about deinstitutionalization as what it is, which is the largest decarceration movement in US history. And I think this narrative really, really obscures that.
Thank you, Liat. That was extremely informative. Thank you so much for drawing those connections and making sure that we all understand that history. This next question is for Angela and Beth. So some Asian American Pacific Islander organizers have vocally resisted calls for increased policing and imprisonment, even with the increasing reports of violence against vulnerable Asians and Asian Americans on the street. But we don't have community infrastructures everywhere to prevent violence or ensure safety. What are some examples of community safety initiatives that prevent or address random violence based on identity? In other words, are there other abolitionist type safety projects that we might look to as blueprints for organizing safety beyond policing?
Okay, Beth, why don't you begin?
Okay, I'll begin. Yeah, such a important and of course really timely question. One of the things when I saw that question that I thought about is how over the past 5 years or 2 years, we keep getting kind of served up the opportunity because of violence in the world. We keep getting served up the opportunity to kind of take a long view. And I think this is one of those opportunities. I say that because one of the most persistent questions that I get as a feminist, abolitionist, anti-violence activist is, what do you do about the violence? And sometimes that question is, what do you do about the killer cop? What do you do about the serial murderer? What do you do about the person who has committed such egregious harm that even as abolitionists, we want to throw up our hands and say, we can't handle that in our sphere of the world? And I used to try to answer that question. I still sometimes do. I'm glad no one asked it today. But instead of trying to answer it, I'm learning from talking to different groups of anti-carceral feminists. And I really want to give a specific shout out to Miriam Kaba and a group of activists who are, instead of trying to answer that question, asking a question, sort of turning it back so that you understand where these kinds of questions are coming from. So the first question is, where's the risk of violence coming from? What's coming from people, for sure, but soon as people answer that, often we can start to identify that the violence is also coming from the state. And so then we can ask, how does individual harm that's compounded by state violence, how do we make sense of the connection between those two? And it's often hard because we haven't sort of sharpened our analytical vision to see that connection. And so we could argue that, organizers in the API community have been talking about violence for a long time. There's an immediate escalation of the conversation, even though there may or may not be an escalation in the violence. But what is clearer, maybe, is the obvious connection between hate rhetoric, exclusionary policies, persistent discrimination, dehumanizing stereotypes, invisibility, all of those manifestations of state oppression, right alongside a clearer view of individual harm. I have been moved, I've really admired the activists who have resisted calling for increased policing and punishment, and really pushed back against, and thoughtful pushback, not a rhetorical pushback, a thoughtful pushback against reforms like hate crime legislation. And I won't speak for others, but from my observation and engagement in some of those discussions, I can see that part of what's starting to unfold is that the challenge, Vicki, is not only that there isn't infrastructure in a community to keep people safe. For sure, that's not there. But it's also clear that what is in communities is the carceral state, and the carceral state won't protect the people that it's targeted, either directly, or the carceral state won't undo its role in creating the opportunity or the space or legitimize the violence that people are experiencing. So instead, I feel like there's a series of questions like, what's the role of random people in responding to what seems like random violence, everyday people? What are the small scale efforts at a local level where the dynamics are really understood? What are the small scale things that people can do? People who've been affected by violence know when it's kind of coming at them and often know how to help. We learn to sense that once we've experienced violence. What can we get trained up to do about that? And I say we, I'm trying to talk about like a collective sense, and it's in part like stronger community bonds, but I don't want to like overly romanticize communities here. I mean, what can we do to say, in this part of our world, we're vulnerable and we better do something to take care of each other and protect each other, not call the police who's then substituted by a social worker, right? And so, you know, we can point to a lot of programs like Creative Interventions and Project NIA and Safe Outside the System. In Chicago, we have a group, the Black Abolition Network. BYP 100, the Black Youth Project 100, has a project called She Safe, We Safe, Love and Protect and Survived and Punished, API Chai. There's a lot of organizational names I would want to call, and maybe, I don't know, the New Press can put them up on their website or something. But my point here is that I'm moved by and really convinced by initiatives that say we have to deal with individual and state harm, and we can't turn to the state because the state is clearly implicated in the state harm, and the state harm clearly influences the individual harm. To me, that's an abolition feminist perspective. It's one that is deeply informed by my work as an anti-violence activist. And when I learned, you know, sort of back in the day when we were framing this in pretty narrow gender terms, that to try to interrupt gender-based violence by policing or imprisoning people meant that we were using the same patriarchal, white-dominated system to try to police itself. It wasn't going to happen. So the resistance to relying on reform, and instead the tendency to look at how does safety individual safety linked to broader questions about freedom. I think that's what we want in these discussions, and I think that's what we need in order to be safe.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. I think I want to approach this on a slightly different register, and want to focus on the fact that the pervasive anti-Asian violence that we're seeing now is being represented as something new that needs a solution. And of course, there's a long history of anti-Asian violence. I'm thinking about the really important work of CAV, Committee Against Asian Violence, over decades now, since the murder of Vincent Chin. And I want to focus very specifically on Black participation in this anti-Asian violence, and what we might do to develop a different kind of consciousness, because it seems to me a lot of this is about the impact of ideologies, and you know, of course, we're critical of 45 for serving as a catalyst of this wave of anti-Asian violence. But he didn't invent it. It's been a part of the history of this country since at least since the anti-Asian Exclusion Acts. So I think what I'm suggesting is that we figure out how to do the kinds of campaigns that will persuade Black organizations that we have a very important role to play in doing the organizing and shifting the consciousness. And of course, we tend to assume that whatever it is we want to mitigate is always going to be there. I mean, that's one of the problems, as Beth was pointing out, with the way in which gender violence is treated. The assumption is that it's always going to be a part of our landscape, and we have to figure out how to deal with the impact on individuals. But my question would be how we would go about challenging the ideologies that are motivating people in the first place, and how we make this a part of an integral part of our organizing against systemic racism. And I can just point out that if one looks at the long struggle for Black freedom, the Black liberation movement, the contributions that Asians and Asian Americans have made to the struggle for Black liberation can never be overestimated. And I think that aside from, which is so important, dealing with the specific kinds of strategies based in the community that can respond to and prevent this, we also have to examine why even in the 21st century, Asian Americans are considered to be eternally outside of the eternal outsiders with respect to the U.S. and the notions of citizenship.
Thank you so much, Angela and Beth. So shifting gears just a little bit, over the past few weeks, we have obviously seen an escalation of Israel's settler colonial violence against Palestinians. And obviously that's ongoing despite the so-called ceasefire. And we wanted to make sure to talk about that today because these issues are so interconnected, as you mentioned earlier, Angela. And so for Angela and Liat, what are your thoughts about the connections between policing, abolition, disability, and Palestine?
Angela, do you want to go first?
No, you could go first.
So I just want to say, I think this is really, really important to talk about. And I wish we had more time, and we're running out of time. So I'll try to be very brief. I want to say that, first of all, for those who don't know me, I come from 48 Israel. I grew up there. But it's important to note that I became politicized as an anti-occupation activist much before I was politicized as a disability activist. And I think it's a very kind of unique position to be in, even though I was disabled, but I didn't understand it as a kind of politics. And so I just want to, for the sake of time, I want to read a part of a statement that we wrote in the Abolition and Disability Justice Collective. And I'm going to also drop that in the chat here. And people are welcome to distribute it and look at it. But this is kind of our analysis of abolition, Palestine, and disability. So it begins, Israeli settler colonialism is a disability justice issue that underscores the urgency of abolition and its internationalist dimensions. Israel routinely maims and traumatizes Palestinians, uses money, weapons, and policing tactics from the US and Canada, amongst other settler colonial states. For example, Israeli restrictions on the movement of people and goods keep Palestinians from accessing food, clear water, healthcare, and these constraints also prevent disabled Palestinians from gaining access to wheelchair, hearing aids, medications, and more. Additionally, Israel controls and deprives Palestinians basic economic, educational, and social opportunities. And we talk about how that works in the context of Palestine and especially Gaza. Israel, much like the US and Canada, has also hoarded COVID-19 vaccines. So while being celebrated as a beacon for its vaccination efforts, Israel has denied the same access to Palestinians in areas that it occupies. Just this week, Israel has bombed the only COVID clinic in Gaza, has destroyed infrastructure around the primary hospital, and has killed 3 leading doctors and their families in Gaza. The settler colonial states of the US and Canada have pledged to continue supporting Israel's settler colonial project. At the same time, the US and Canada are systematically disinvesting in communities across the US and Canada, which specifically impact disabled, deaf, and neurodivergent communities, particularly communities of color. As I'm sure Angela will note, Israeli weapons, military, police tactics, and technologies cycle between Israel, the US, and Canada. We'll talk about that more. The last thing I want to say, one of the things that people have not shared is how, and we talk about it in the statement, as the United States does, Israeli police have brutalized and killed countless disabled people with impunity. Police caused injuries and trauma with these various technologies. Within the 1948 lines, or what we call Israel, we have seen an intensification of racialized police violence against Palestinians, citizens of Israel. And I think that that has not been talked about as much. This has ranged from attacking demonstrators with stun grenades and tear gas to preventing civilians injured by police from accessing medical care, to violently breaking into homes to arrest people. Overall, more than 1,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel were arrested. This is just in the last 2 weeks, over half of whom are minors, while only 150 Israeli Jews were arrested at the same time, and none of the Israeli Jews were charged. Furthermore, the police escorted and protected fascist Israeli settler militias while they were rampaging through the streets, targeting Palestinians' lives and property. And therefore, our calls for police abolition are imperative in this context as well. So we demand an end to the occupation of Palestine. We demand the abolition of the open-air prison in Gaza. We demand an end to the attacks on hospitals and clinics. We demand prison and police abolition, which includes an immediate end to the exchange of weapons, military and police funds and tactics between the US, Canada, and Israel. We called for BDS, and we call for decolonization and Palestinian liberation, for anti-imperialism and for anti-militarism to be a central part of the stability organizing agendas in the US and Canada.
Wow, thank you so much, Liat. Yeah, I think I want to, this is such a important topic, and I'm feeling a bit frustrated that we don't have more time to discuss this, but the point I think I want to make is that we should not underestimate the role that Palestine solidarity movements have played in broadening and deepening our movement against the institution of the prison and the police here in this country. Abolition, which has now become a part of the mainstream discourse, so for better or worse, is very much linked to struggles to generate solidarity for Palestinians who are resisting the occupation. Now, I'm not sure whether we would be where we are today in terms of our responses to racist police violence as structural and systemic, had we not developed the connections with Palestinian activists. The whole question of militarization of the police, which we began to recognize in the context of the Ferguson movement, really was possible as a consequence of learning about the role that the Israeli army plays in relation to police all over the world, but especially here within the US. Where I live, there was an effort to challenge the Urban Shield series of expositions and war games in which Israel played a central role. So the point I'm making is that where we are today in terms of being able to demand abolition of the police, defunding the police, owes a great deal to our connections with Palestinians struggling against the occupation. And I also want to point to Brazil, because there's a very, very important movement, BDS movement and movements in general to challenge the occupation of Palestine inside Brazil. And I don't think it's accidental that we also see someone like Marielle Franco, who centered campaigns against militarization of the police there. Now, as Liat pointed out, and thank you so much for the comprehensive response to this question, that the resources, the financial resources for this militarization in relation to the occupation come from the US, the $38 billion over the next 10 years that have been allocated specifically for the military. And that means that people in this country, we who pay taxes, are the ones funding the violence there. Let's not forget that. The last thing I want to point out is that despite all of the destruction and the pain and the suffering linked to what is happening now, we see some really exciting developments. in terms of the ways in which Palestinians have forged a kind of unity that we have not witnessed in many, many years. Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank, and Palestinians who are citizens inside Israel. And I'm not even referred to as Palestinians, but rather as Arabs. The extent to which that unity has been forged should serve as an inspiration, not only to those of us who have been involved in solidarity actions with our Palestinian comrades, but in terms of the possibilities of changing the world. And I don't think it's accidental that in the US we've seen the huge mobilizations that led to greater consciousness of the structural character of racism, and mobilizations in other parts of the world. And now we see the vast mobilizations on the West Bank and Gaza and inside 48. So the Liat is talked about the really important way in which we have to incorporate insights regarding disability activism and anti-imperialist, anti-colonial activism, decolonial activism in the area. Yeah, let's. I just want to say that we cannot accomplish what we want to do in this country. We can't change the country without understanding that it is a part of a global framework. And at this point, it seems to me the very center of the world is occupied Palestine, Gaza, and 48 in Israel.
Thank you, Angela, and I am too sorry that we don't have time. So we only have time for one more question. And I want to, sorry, and so we have time for one more question. We do try to incorporate people's questions from the Q&As. I'm sure you've noticed about some of the things that we covered. But the question that came most often in the Q&A, and we want to end today with, is, can you highlight exactly what you were just saying, Angela? Can you highlight any examples of campaigns or efforts to counter carcerality that are grounded in feminist, disability justice, or other liberatory principles, either locally or globally? So you started to share about kind of the long array of the Black liberation struggle, the Palestinian solidarity, and so on. But I just want to kind of point to basically everybody, if you want to end with just uplifting a campaign or an issue. Maya, do you want to start, or Vicky?
Sure, I can start. I'll try to quickly touch on just a couple of projects, and of course there are millions, but just thinking about some of the issues that have arisen today and some of the things in the comments or Q&A. So I'm part of Love and Protect, which Beth mentioned earlier. And Love and Protect is an abolitionist feminist collective in Chicago that supports criminalized survivors who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color who've survived both state and interpersonal violence. And we support people when they're in prison and when they've gotten out with a feminist abolitionist approach. So, for example, we give people money for commissary while they're incarcerated without strings attached. This is something that's counter to the way that a lot of social service organizations that are embedded in the system operate. And also at Love and Protect, we have an emergency fund, which we're hoping to continue building for when people get out of prison. That money does not have mandates or strings attached. And meanwhile, we're offering survivors optional emotional support as they're obviously facing trauma. So we're building connections, we're reaching out, but we're not saying you have to be friends with us or you have to be clients of ours in some way in order to get resources. So that's just like one small example. And I also want to briefly mention, thinking about the social workers question we discussed earlier, a group called Social Service Workers United Chicago, which are abolitionist social service workers who are trying to fundamentally challenge the field of social work and thinking about how the entire framework has to change. And I want to make sure other people can talk, so I'll just recommend people look up their work, Social Service Workers United Chicago. But there are some exciting things happening there in terms of transformation.
The example that I'll lift up, I so love and protect. I mean, I feel like the inside outside work is it's so moving and it's so important. And the example I want to lift up is kind of related to that and grew out of the ground that Love and Protect and Survived and Punished created. And it's called the Moment of Truth. And the Moment of Truth is a statement that was put together by a group of anti-violence, anti-gender violence activists who came from Insight. So I'm naming Insight here as another group, but this is like a contemporary version of Insight, where it calls for a kind of reconciling of what we as gender violence activists have done to feed the prison nation, like what part of our work very specifically is implicated in over-policing, over-surveillance, and not only death by incarceration, but also the lack of safety and support and freedom for people who needed services. So it's one, looking at our role in that. Two, it's saying we have to do our work differently. So it's not only critique, we're not only tear it down, but we're also building up. How do we do anti-gender-based violence work without being carceral feminists? So it's a call for changing our paradigms, doing different kinds of services, engaging in the world differently. Three, and it's very sort of moving after the discussion about Palestine, which I don't want to just kind of leave hanging there. It also says, how do we see ourselves as part of social justice movements, not just people who provide services? And so what does the anti-gender-based violence movement have to say around the question of Palestine right now? Like, how do we come up with a way of thinking about the resistance, the organizing, the death and destruction, the colonialism, the imperialism? How is that not our work, right? How do we engage with that? It's very important, and I think really moving that this group is taking that up. And then I think lastly, kind of challenging legislative reform. And it just is a constant parade of problematic legislative reform, every place from the Violence Against Women Act to local police reforms. And how do we just stay on top of the, I'm going to go back to where I started, the ways that violence at the state is disguised as if it's going to bring safety and freedom. And so to me, the Moment of Truth is a statement that you can easily find online. It's both a statement and then it has this action surrounding it that, at least in the world that I work in, is really moving. And I do want to say in particular, the challenge that I think Liat, the statement that you put in the chat, Liat and Angela, your invitation to have this be the center of our universe, if we're interested in abolition and ending violence right now, it's a real call to action, no matter what kind of work we think we're doing for abolition.
I would lift up two things. One is a website called Million Experiments, 1 million experiments. So building off things like creative interventions and different toolkits, because abolition is not, we take out the 2.2 million people currently behind bars, pull it out, and then replace it with another gigantic puzzle piece. It's how do we actually address harm and violence as they occur? And that looks different for different people and in different scenarios. What works for Maya might not work for Beth, might not work for me, might not work for Angela, might not work for Liat. So, but it gives us blueprints and stories to look at, to start firing up our imaginations as to what is possible, and what we can do and what we can learn from other people. And then sort of more concretely looking at the intersections of disability justice and abolition in Washington state right now. There's a campaign to stop the proposed $612 million expansion of Western State Hospital, which is the largest psychiatric hospital west of the Mississippi River. So it's a coalition of folks from No New Washington prisons, which formed and stopped a proposed new women's prison in Washington state last year, and a group called the Shut Them Down Coalition. And they're teaming up to say, we don't want people to be locked away in prisons or in jails or in psychiatric confinement. We don't want to lock people away. So I would also urge people to check them out. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to their website and their teach-in, which is, I think, tomorrow. So people can check that out. And I think that they're going to have more information on recordings and other actions to take. So Million Experiments, and then also more concretely, look for campaigns that are happening near you that you can get involved in.
Thank you. Angela, you have the last word in the last minute.
I just, want to say how amazing this conversation has been, how much I've learned. And so my last word is simply gratitude to you for doing the work. Thank you so much on behalf of all those to come who will, follow in your footsteps and make abolition a reality.
Thank you so much. Maya and Vicky, do you have a closing?
Well, we had talked about how I was going to juggle fire, but I did not learn that ahead of this event. I have to admit, I'm actually like not coordinated. So, yeah, I'm just so grateful for everyone coming together and having this conversation and agreeing to cover such a wide range of topics. And thank you to everyone who joined us and stuck it out for an hour and 45 minutes. I'm very impressed with you too. And yeah, just thankful. How about you, Vicky?
Everything you just said, and I think that hopefully everybody comes away feeling inspired to continue doing this work, to get involved in doing this work if you haven't been, to continue doing this work, to broaden what we're thinking of as abolition, to not just the physical jails and prisons and police cars and police vans, but also looking at the intersections like disability justice, like fights against gender violence, and looking at fighting for the world we want to see, not just the things that we don't want to see in this world. And I'm so grateful to Angela and to Beth and to Liat for being in conversation with us. Your work has been so tremendously powerful and important. And I'm always grateful to Maya, even if she won't learn to juggle fire. I don't know why, for being my co-author and my co-adventurer on this.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.